History is written by survivors. But what happens when the survivor refuses to write it? The Chronicles of Ivalice record the 50 Years' War, the War of the Lions, the wars that built and broke kingdoms. They remember the celebrated and the condemned. But one name is missing. Ramza Beoulve. Born to House Beoulve, son of Balbinus, hero of the 50 Years' War. Raised with every advantage his name could buy. Taught that honor meant loyalty. That peace justified any cost. Until he saw the cost. Behind the church's doctrine and the nobles' intrigues, Ramza uncovered a truth that shattered both. The Zodiac stones, the Lucavi, and the conspiracy that turned heroes into demons. His answer wasn't rebellion. It was conviction. To defend truth at the cost of tradition. To stand with those the powerful discard. Declared heretic. Erased from record. Yet his actions saved Ivalice. This is Ramza Beoulve. The name history buried. But before Ramza Beoulve became a name history refused to speak, he was something simpler. He was the heir of honor, a boy raised to believe that virtue lived in bloodlines, and that righteousness could be inherited like a family crest. Before Ramza Beoulve ever drew a blade, his path was already written for him. He was born the youngest son of Balbinus Beoulve, the hero who held the northern front during the 50 Years' War when every command chart said withdraw. To Ivalice, Balbinus proved loyalty could outlast ruin. To Ramza, he proved that virtue endured. The Beoulve name wasn't just lineage, it was a vow carved in stone. Honor, duty, compassion. 3 words repeated until they became creed. Ramza learned early that obedience was virtue, that justice followed command. The world, he believed, rewarded those who served it faithfully. His brothers understood differently. Dystarg and Zalbag turned that creed into strategy. Duty as leverage, loyalty as currency. Ramza saw their ambition as pragmatism, not betrayal. He mistook calculation for wisdom. When Balbinus died, he left one lesson. Do right, even when it earns you nothing. Ramza took it literally. He believed decency alone could steady a kingdom still fractured by war. Standing beneath the banners of House Beoulve, he never questioned whether those banners deserved defending. He thought goodness could be inherited, as one inherits land or title. But Ivalice was a kingdom where legacy meant debt, and ideals were luxuries measured in coin. Ramza just didn't know it yet. He believed the Beoulve Code could survive any corruption, redeem any compromise, if only he held fast to its principles. Then came the first doubt. Quiet, unwelcome, impossible to ignore. It arrived not in grand betrayal, but in a simple observation. The peace his family protected fed on the suffering of those it claimed to serve. Ramza Beoulve entered the Royal Military Academy believing discipline could heal a broken kingdom. The uniform, the code, the order. All symbols of his father's world, proof that righteousness could be practiced like a craft. His first assignment fractured that belief. The command was dispassionate. Suppress a riot in the Magic City. The report called it civil unrest, as if hunger were a crime. The reality was starvation. Men and women beaten for stealing bread they could no longer afford. Soldiers enforcing stability for nobles who had never missed a meal. Ramza followed orders. The crowd dispersed. The streets fell silent. but that silence felt heavier than the screams that came before it. He told himself this was an exception, that the crown still stood for justice, and cruelty was merely the failure of lesser men. Yet the image would not fade. Armored knights striking unarmed peasants. Steel against hunger. For the first time, Ramza questioned whether obedience and goodness were the same thing. It was a small doubt, easily buried beneath duty and routine. But it was there, a hairline fracture in the armor of certainty that would widen with every order he followed. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, just not for the people bleeding to sustain it. That realization revealed the weight of a name he'd carried without question. Ramza began to understand that Beoulve was much more than merely an identity. It was a shield, one that protected him from truth as much as it protected him from consequence. The uniform could be cast aside. The name could not. Everywhere Ramza went, Beoulve arrived first. Orders came easier, discipline bent softer. Mistakes vanished without consequence. His commanders saw Balbinus's ghost standing behind him. His peers saw someone who had never faced judgment. He told himself the name was influence, that with it, he could accomplish more than any common blade. Yet even self-deception frays with time. That same name pardoned atrocities when others wielded it. Nobles invoked his father's honor to justify their indulgence in cruelty. Ramza began to understand. In Ivalice, virtue wasn't principle. Virtue was currency. His family's code, honor, duty, compassion, it had decayed from creed to ornament. Words stitched on banners rather than carved into souls. The men who bore his crest at war now used it as a veil for corruption. They preached justice while starving villages with taxes, swore loyalty while selling soldiers to the highest bidder. Each salute felt hollower. What had once been devotion now played like theater, gestures performed for an audience that no longer believed. For the first time, Ramza questioned whether the Beoulve name deserved preservation at all. Perhaps the only way to truly honor it was to unmake everything it had become. Every privilege his name granted became another barrier between him and the people his honor was supposed to protect. And so the code shattered. Not in a single moment of rebellion, but through 1,000 small refusals to look away. Ramza stopped asking, what would a Beoulve do? Instead, he started asking, what does conscience demand? The Beoulve crest still hung on his armor. The meaning beneath it had splintered. Each order sounded less like duty and more like reflex. Commands obeyed because they had always been obeyed. Nothing more. Ramza began seeing his father's code for what it had become in practice. Obedience disguised as honor. Cruelty dressed in ceremony. When nobles demanded loyalty, they meant silence. When they promised peace, they meant submission. He tried to reconcile it, tried to believe a line still existed between justice and blind obedience. But every mission erased it further. A soldier punished for mercy, a village burned because desperation looked like rebellion. The rules he'd memorized at Garland no longer protected the innocent. They only shielded those who wrote them in the first place. He stopped quoting the code, stopped saluting with conviction. Quietly, at first, then openly. Every small refusal carried the weight of treason. But it also felt like breathing again. To the nobility, he was naive, a child mistaking ideals for wisdom. To the church, dangerous, a fracture in their order. To himself, uncertain. But for the first time, honest. The creed that had defined him was gone. What remained was instinct. Compassion stripped of permission, duty without the need to obey. This was the moment the night began to fade, and the heretic drew his first breath. He began acting on conscience instead of command, serving truth instead of tradition. But conviction alone couldn't prepare him for the death of faith. The moment when every illusion he'd clung to would burn away in a single, irreversible act of violence. Titra's death didn't just break Ramza's heart. It broke his last belief that goodness could survive within corrupt institutions. Ramza Beoulve's rebellion began quietly. In thought, in silence, in refusal. But every heretic needs a moment of truth. For Ramza, his came at Fort Zeakden. When Titra was taken hostage, Ramza still believed decency could prevail. He trusted his brothers. He trusted the code. He trusted that the nobility he'd served would never sacrifice an innocent for expedience. He was wrong. Argith Adolphus, noble by blood, coward by nature, called her life collateral. Dystarg hesitated, but only for a moment. Zalbag gave the order. And in the chaos that followed, Titra died. Her body caught between ideals and artillery. That single moment silenced every sermon Ramza had ever believed. The Beoulve name, the Knight's Oath, the Church's blessing, all of it shattered under the weight of her death. Ramza's faith in justice didn't die because evil triumphed. It died because evil wore his family's crest. He buried his sister with hands still stained by obedience. Then he walked away. From his name, from his brothers, from the world that called itself righteous while drowning in blood. To the realm, he vanished. To history, he became a traitor. To himself, for the first time, he became free. He would never again mistake order for peace, or obedience for virtue, or silence for loyalty. That day at Zeakden, the noble died. And in the silence, the mercenary was born. He walked away from House Beoulve, from the church, from every identity that had once defined him. What emerged from that loss was the heretic's birth. Not a rejection of principle, but its purest distillation. Exiled and alone, stripped of name and nation, Ramza finally understood what his father had tried to teach him. True honor requires no permission, no witness, no reward. In the months after Zeakden, Ivalice whispered Ramza Beoulve's name like a curse. The church called him traitor. The nobility called him mad. Only the dead knew he was right. He vanished into the borderlands, stripped of title and protection. The sigil on his armor meant nothing now, just the crest of a family he'd buried alongside his sister. At first, exile felt like punishment. Then it felt like release. For the first time, he owed allegiance to no one. No orders to follow, no banners to salute. No sermons to reconcile with the weight of spilled blood. What remained was the single truth his father had left behind, buried beneath ceremony and lies. Do right, even when it earns you nothing. He began living by that line, not as a knight, but as a man. He helped where he could, fought when he must, and refused every chain offered in the name of peace, of order, or of faith. The church called that heresy. Ramza called it clarity. He learned that unseen righteousness was still righteousness, that unwitnessed good still mattered, that he no longer needed the world's permission to be decent. In exile, Ramza Beoulve stopped serving history. he began serving truth. He learned to act without approval, to choose righteousness when history would never record his name. But clarity doesn't guarantee comfort. By the time Ramza joined Gafgarian's company, he'd become the jaded mercenary, a man whose idealism had hardened into something sharper, more dangerous. His conviction remained, but the innocence that once softened it was gone. He understood now that saving the world and surviving it were two very different things. When spring arrived, Ramza Beoulve had vanished. What remained was a nameless sellsword. No family crest, no noble title, no faith left to lose. He signed on with Gafgarian's mercenary company, where men fought for gold, not glory. Among them, loyalty had a cost. For Ramza, it was something else entirely. It was a crucible. He had once believed honor could be taught through example, that righteousness could elevate the corrupt. War had taught him otherwise. The world didn't hunger for sermons. It needed someone willing to act when action meant sacrifice without reward or recognition. The mercenary life offered something the nobility never could: brutal honesty. No false virtue, no hollow sermons, just survival, raw and unvarnished. These men didn't pretend to be righteous or noble. And finally, Ramza could stop pretending too. Yet, beneath the cynicism, something endured. Conviction stripped to its core, but still breathing. He still intervened when others looked away. He still raised his blade against cruelty wearing the mask of law. He had learned to serve without belonging, to act without reward. The church branded him heretic. History would call him forgotten. But the truth? He had become something far more dangerous. A man who no longer required faith to choose righteousness. When the rains returned, a new contract arrived. Escort duty for a princess departing Orban Monastery. Ramza accepted without ceremony. Another war was stirring in Ivalice's shadows. And the heretic who had turned away from history was about to rewrite it forever. He faced the War of the Lions not as a noble seeking glory, but as a man who'd already lost everything that mattered, and discovered that loss had made him free. The church called that blasphemy. The nobles called it treason. Centuries later, historians called it myth. History remembers crowns, not conscience. It immortalizes conquerors, not those who refuse to conquer. Ramza Beoulve entered a world that equated honor with obedience, justice with power, virtue with bloodline. He spent his youth believing true righteousness could survive within corrupt systems. When that illusion collapsed, he didn't abandon righteousness. He abandoned the need for permission. He surrendered his name, his family, his nation, every privilege nobility promised. But what he gained proved infinitely rarer: the freedom to act without seeking belief, recognition, or reward. Ramza never pursued glory, never demanded remembrance. He simply rejected the notion that decency required authority, or the truth needed approval to endure. The church named it heresy. The nobility branded it treason. Centuries later, scholars reduced it to legend. Yet for those who listen for the names Ivalice tried to erase, his story persists, not as myth, but as testament. The chronicles of a man who discovered that faith's purest expression isn't worship or devotion. It's the courage to choose righteousness when history will never record your name. Ramza walked away from power. But his childhood friend, Delita Heiral, seized it and paid a price far darker than any exile.